Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing coverage of A Game of Thrones, bringing you the best thoughts, theories, and literary analysis this side of the mountain clans.
Ooh, also, Happy Christmas, everybody. That was earlier this week.
Happy Christmas.
Yeah, we're British today. I've decided. I was like, should I say Happy Holidays? And I was like, well, no, like, the holiday that just occurred is Christmas. Although, I think Hanukkah's happening right now. Anyway, happy, merry everything.
None of them are happening in Westeros.
Well,
We've
that's
gathered
true.
today to talk about Tyrion, Chapter 7. We finally, after almost a year of talking about this book and diving into these characters, we finally get to meet Tywin.
Yeah.
We've learned so much about him. We've gotten so much lore and horrible backstory. His shadow has loomed over half of these characters, but he's finally in this chapter. And we've got all sorts of ideas we want to play with there. But before we get into that discussion, Maggie, what happens in this chapter? Spoilers for the book and the show.
I'm going to tell you in just a moment, but first, before we get into the recap, I want to remind you all that Cam's book, Lemon Tarts in Space, is available for purchase via all sorts of outlets. You can get it as a paperback, you can get it as an audio drama. The link is down below in the description of this video / podcast episode, depending on whatever way you're watching this. But it is available and it is so much fun, and I highly recommend you check it out. So I wanted to say that at the top rather than thrown in at the end, because not everybody listens to the end, which I understand.
That's a good point.
It's here. Also, we did a whole interview series promoting the book where we talked about the writing, the recording process of the audio drama, and the editing and production side, because Cam did all three of those and more. So if you want to learn more about the book in a spoiler-free but still interesting way, talking about the book in a way that we talk about stuff here on the show, you can check those out. Those are available in your podcast or YouTube feed.
Yes, it's a light science fiction dark comedy. It's Ridley Scott's Alien by way of Monty Python. You can get it through Amazon, you can get it through Barnes & Noble, all sorts of options at the link in the bio.
Perfect. So anyway, back to the book. Let me tell you about Tyrion, Chapter 7. So Tyrion is with a bunch of his free men from the mountains. We've got some stone crows, some moon brothers, some black ears. Is that what it is? Black ears?
I think so.
Okay,
There's
black
a lot
ears.
of ear talk.
Yeah, and burned men. And they all they both work for Tyrion, but they also kind of own him at the same time. It's a very confusing dynamic. Also, these guys are also called clansmen with a C. I just want to clarify that. If you hear me say clansmen, that's what I'm talking about.
There are definitely other ways to say it.
Yeah, but that's not what I mean. Okay, so they're all together, and they learn that a Lannister army is nearby, so they go to visit. It's either going to be Jaime's or Tywin's. Turns out it's Tywin's. And we learn that Tywin is staying at the inn at the crossroads. The very inn at the crossroads where Catelyn Stark captured Tyrion way back when. So that's captured. I can't. Tyrion. I want to talk like this the whole time. Catelyn Lannister. Okay. Anyway, so they're going to this inn to see Tywin. And this is where we, as Cam said, we meet Tywin Lannister for the first time. And we also learn how the war has been going. Tywin tells us that the Lannisters are doing very well. The Tully force is all but defeated, and Edmure Tully has been taken captive. What?
I don't ever remember, like Edmure Tully, in the books and the show. I only remember him in captivity.
Poor guy.
Does he have more than one day of sunlight?
I don't think
in
so.
In this entire series?
He has a tough time of it. That's Catelyn's brother, right? Edmure? Okay, cool.
And he doesn't have a great time in Outlander either.
I was going to say, that's the guy
Menzies.
Who plays... Okay, that's Tobias Menzies.
One of our greatest living actors.
He's a great actor. Okay, yeah, so he's been captured, so that's too bad. Basically, we learned that all they need to do is take River Run, and then, the war is ended. So that's not looking good for our Stark friends, okay? Tywin is not worried about Robb Stark, because Robb Stark is 15 and, has never fought in a war. And he's yeah, it's not going to be a problem. So that's where everything stands. And Tyrion is just about to announce his plan to his father that he's going to basically take out the Vale with all of his clansmen and stuff.
His what?
Yeah, but before he can do that, we learn a messenger barges in, and we learn that Robb Stark is on the move with his army. And so things sort of, Tyrion's plans have to halt for a moment. And Tywin basically convinces all of Tyrion's clansmen to join him and fight against Robb Stark.
Did you write clansmen?
No, but that's the easiest thing to say. What am I going to say? Mountain men?
The mountain clans.
The mountain clans. Fine. He convinces his mountain clans to fight with him against Robb Stark. And that's where we leave it.
Excellent.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. I felt the need to heckle just for posterity.
That's fine. I deserved it.
Yeah, so let's start with Tywin. There is some stuff to talk about with Tyrion, but I think we should start with Tywin here.
I agree.
we're now 2 or 3 chapters into the latest Targaryen checkpoint. So chapters since our last Dany chapter that sort of previewed the major themes that are going to permeate the intervening chapters here. And we talked about this idea of plot lines continuing to converge or coalesce as the scope tightens and we get towards the end of the book. Instead of everyone spreading out on their own, we're starting to see finally some more crossover and resolution. And I like in that spirit that we finally get to meet the big bad of this series. Do you think that's a fair label before I keep going?
Sure. Yeah. The big bad, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. He's absolutely the big bad. He is the one who's been talked about. And like it's always clear anytime he's mentioned that he is more powerful, more domineering, and more of a threat compared to any other Lannister on the page.
Okay.
Yeah, for
good.
sure.
Yeah. I wasn't sure if I was just... I try to look past my Stark bias, but I don't think I'm ever successful. Because most of this chapter is a long, ominous kind of red carpet being rolled out. And at the end of it is Tywin. It's this road to Tywin that I feel like we as the reader have been on since, last December.
Yeah, right.
But that's the fun of it. It reminded me of that speech in Oppenheimer where Robert Downey Jr. is talking about true power existing in the shadows. Because that's where we've seen him. And we're only seeing him pop on stage. We're only seeing him in the flesh now because he's absolutely winning this war. He's decimating Robb Stark right now. He's already got Ned Stark in the dungeon and Robert Baratheon is dead. So he's emerging from the shadows as the victor.
I see.
I feel like this is a tactical... it's weird because it's a tactical emergence from him, but also the way George R. Martin finally deploys the character.
Yeah, that's true. Those two things come together and come to be at the same time. That's nice.
It reminded me really strongly of the way Sapkowski kind of withheld his villains in the Witcher series. Because there were a lot of characters. I mean, do you remember Bonhart?
Yeah.
There were a lot of brutally awful people in that universe.
Sure.
In the way that I couldn't point at one person and say, you're the big bad.
Sure. I mean, I guess the closest is like Vilgefortz. But remember, we would go like chapters and books without seeing him. And also that one emperor guy, he was also like, we hardly ever saw him.
Var Emrys?
That's something like that. Yeah, that sounds about right.
My brain is atrophied enough that I don't know if it's Var or Von. But yes, exactly. That's who I had in my notes was Vilgefortz and Emhyr, where they were the true power of this world. But that meant they didn't need to meddle directly.
No, they didn't. Yeah.
They had all these other people to do their bidding. And I like that we're finally seeing that kind of seat of true power now that the king has been deposed, now that there is sort of a free-for-all on King's Landing.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Sorry. So the way that Tywin has been introduced at this point in the plot makes sense with all you're saying about him being in the shadows. He no longer is. Why do you think George chose to introduce Tywin in a Tyrion chapter? Why not introduce him in some other way? Like, obviously, like, it makes sense for him to be introduced now at this time in the plot, but he could have written it in a way that we meet him through Catelyn or through, I don't know, Ned, or, I mean, I was going to say like Jaime or Cersei, but we don't actually have their perspectives just yet. But it didn't have to be Tyrion. So why Tyrion?
I think it sort of does, because none of the Stark kids know Tywin at all. I don't even know if they'd recognize him if they saw him. How many times would they have ever been in a room with Tywin Lannister?
Sure, but they
can't look him up on Facebook.
But he would be announced as Tywin. Like, it would be made clear who it was. But it wouldn't
mean anything to Bran to see Tywin Lannister. And like you sort of got to there, Tyrion is our only Lannister POV.
True. Yeah.
So obviously we know from the Tysha story and all this other awful lore that it means the most. It's the most well-read perspective on Tywin that we have so far in this story. Jon Snow would just see, oh, Lannisters are shits. Here's the big shit Lannister. But I think it means much more from Tyrion because he's one of, I mean, what is it? Him and Dany are the only non-Stark POVs?
Yeah, right now,
It might be interesting from Ned, but Ned's in a dungeon. So yeah, and Tywin isn't sitting... Like Joffrey right now is on the throne. Tywin's not going to be that sort of hand of the king like Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings. He's not going to be cowering next to him, whispering in his ear.
Sure.
He's way too strong for that. So yeah, I think it has to be Tyrion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the closest, next best choice would be Catelyn somehow. I don't know how that would happen, but...
She's doing a lot of other intros right now.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah. And I think her perspective on Tywin would be well, I was going to say it would be so skewed, but so is Tyrion's. Tyrion's incredibly biased about his father.
But in a more fruitful way.
Yeah, you're right.
It means more.
It is fun that that's how we get to meet him. And I don't know if we ever get to see Tywin, like what other POVs we get Tywin through for a long time. Like before we get to have Jaime and Cersei, who else gets to have a Tywin one-on-one? Like I don't know who else. So
yeah, because even Robb, he'll never have his own POV chapters.
No, right. And I don't think there's ever a moment in the story where Catelyn and Tywin speak to each other. So yeah, it's interesting though. But this is fun to sort of pinpoint why this point in the plot is where we meet him.
But Tywin gets almost the most traditional character introduction of anyone we've had in this book. It felt like one of those old school, and I mean that in the American sense of Fitzgerald and Hemingway, where the narrative slows down for a second, you get a couple remarkable and memorable physical traits, a couple little anecdotes about the backstory and how they look, and the second his hairline started receding, he shaved his head because he doesn't believe in half measures.
Loved that.
That felt like a really classic kind of Gatsby-esque character introduction of not just pay attention to this guy, but you're interested in him. It's not about do I like him, do I not like him. None of these characters are that simple, but he's intriguing immediately.
I also liked how the way he was described was very tied to Tyrion and how Tyrion feels about him, because Tyrion can recognize objective truths and things about the people around him. But there was also just this element of like Tyrion specific stuff, like the idea that Tywin doesn't like half measures. I immediately thought of Tyrion as a half man or like as a halfling, and how like the disapproval of his father is like so like intense and potent for Tyrion when he's around him. Like it even says like whenever he felt his father looking at him, he felt so much worse about himself. His like, his imperfections, his, things that don't measure up to his father's standards were so obvious and apparent to Tyrion and made him feel so much worse about himself. So the idea that his father doesn't like half measures to me implies his father hates Tyrion for being, half a man.
There's this impatience to Tywin, because I mean it's impossible. Of all the great casting choices that the show made, Charles Dance has got to be up there.
Oh, he's perfect. I mean, I'm just imagining Charles Dance, course, even though he's not bald in the show, and like his facial hair is different, but like his body, his face, his voice, his eyes,
his poise.
Yeah, the fact that he doesn't smile, like I was just picturing Charles Dance. It's really good casting.
Utterly embodies the character
in the same way that oh my God, Peter Dinklage embodies Tyrion. Like I every time Tyrion speaks, it's in Peter Dinklage's voice in my head.
And there's something so snide in Tywin where he has such high expectations. And I think, again, with sort of the double entendre almost of high expectations versus Tyrion being shorter,
yes,
he never will give his approval to Tyrion. But I think I got a sense of impatience from Tywin that I didn't really get from Charles Dance's performance. Because when I watch the show, I can totally make sense of Tywin as this perennial kingmaker, where he's comfortable holding the purse strings of Robert Baratheon's entire empire, but not directly leaning on him. He can apply pressure when he needs to, but he can do it indirectly. He can send Joffrey to bed without supper, but he doesn't have to be more active. But the way he behaved in this scene, he seemed a little bit more hungry than that. He seemed a little bit more impatient, where I've always thought of this guy as the kingmaker. I started to see the potential, especially given where we are geopolitically right now, with how many characters are off the board in this Game of Thrones. I couldn't help see, like, why isn't Tywin the king?
Yeah, or why isn't he trying to be the king? Because I know why he's not, because technically he can't be. But
this
why
book
isn't
version of Tywin could moonwalk onto the throne.
Right. I know what you're saying. Yeah.
He could march right into King's Landing and, Joffrey's too young, I'm going to be his regent. And then just 20 years later, when someone says, what about that temporary regency thing? He just throws him in the dungeons.
Yeah.
Like it could be a fairly quiet coup if he wanted that control. And this version of Tywin seemed like he wanted that control a little bit.
Interesting.
Because no one else is on his level. If you look at the structure of the chapter, it almost felt like these Russian nesting dolls. The relationship between the moon clans.
Sure.
I'm not going to say
the mountain people.
The mountain clans. I don't want to say clansmen.
No.
If you look at the difference between the clans, Tyrion, and Tywin, the way all of these factors kind of wind in and out of each other's storylines, Tyrion in the previous 6 chapters that we've had of his POV, he's outsmarted or outfoxed everyone. He's just run circles around. I mean, he's being polite to the guys at the wall, but he's infinitely smarter than anyone up there.
Sure.
But the second he's in a room with Tywin, he's leapfrogged.
Yeah,
and
immediately.
He's in one scene of this chapter, and he doesn't even talk that much. But, like, look at it this way. In the previous chapter, we saw Tyrion meet the mountain clans, and he had to kind of bargain for his life and give them a bunch of stuff. And here, you want the veil? Take the veil. Tyrion recruited the clans. But Tywin enters the picture and recruits the clans out from under Tyrion, and then lets the clans recruit Tyrion.
Yeah, and Tyrion even recognizes, like, he says, he thinks to himself, oh, how deftly done, the way his father just immediately convinces them to fight for him.
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
It's total domination. It's he makes one move on the board, and it's this compound power play. And Tyrion doesn't push back at all. So if Tyrion was our most savvy power player that's not dead or in prison at this point, Tywin laps him in this one chapter. He makes Tyrion look silly and controls him easily, in the same way Tyrion did to these almost comic relief Moon Clan people.
Right, yeah. So then it puts Tyrion in that really low place.
Yeah, but Tyrion was the top of the mountain for us, because you and I have admired other characters. We admire Jon. But you put Jon in a room with Tywin and he's going to be cleaning the toilets. It's not, no one is even near that level.
Right.
And this is where I want to zoom out to the bigger question and the title of this. If you're watching us on YouTube instead of listening on the podcast, I'm a podcast person, so I'm biased in that direction. But the question that I wanted to build to here is, why aren't the Lannisters unstoppable? Why is Tywin not the puppeteer of everything and everyone in Westeros in perpetuity?
Right. Yeah. I mean, well, and that's, I mean, where we get into, I mean, that's the question of Clash of Kings. That's how Robb is able to, rise and become this king of the North. But it is interesting that we don't see Tywin actively seeking the throne, because I feel like he could have great success if he did. But, I think you could also argue that right now they are unstoppable. Like, the Lannisters are in charge. Like, Tywin's not on the throne, but his grandson/daughter are, and anything they do is going to be, with his approval or with his, seal on there, or it's going to be at his order. Like, when you asked earlier, why isn't Tywin king? My answer was going to be that moment in Harry Potter where they say, why doesn't Voldemort make himself Minister of Magic? And I say, because he doesn't have to. And I think that's the same thing here. Like, he doesn't need to do that. He can, without creating a political problem by doing this coup, he can sit back and relax. I mean, not relax, but he can sit back in the shadows, do a lot of the active work out on the battlefield, and also a lot of the advising and have all this. He does have a lot of control over both Jaime and Cersei, whether or not they admit it. And so he does have all this power. He just doesn't have it technically. But he doesn't need it. You know?
I wanted to ask this question now because we're in a precarious moment. Robb is about to win on the battlefield.
Right.
I believe.
I'm pretty sure you're right.
That's the upset.
I think his plan works. He splits the army in two. Yeah.
He outsmarts Tywin. So after that chapter, we're able to have a different conversation. But in this moment, I think Tywin looks fairly unstoppable. And for everyone who has the rise and fall throughout this series, there's usually one linchpin moment or one enemy that they really underestimate, and that comes back to bite them.
Yeah.
And as you meet Tywin, and he looks so secure, I loved the way George described his figure as having these, he's thin, but he has these cords in all of his muscles. He's not built for show. He doesn't have the muscles that impress people.
Yeah, he's not the mountain.
But he's strong.
Yes.
And it's all of that kind of understated. That's what I want to squint at and make sense of. Because you'd think he would have this legacy play of Jaime, who's this knight in shining armor, and he's going to be my successor, and he's going to keep this Lannister dynasty running for 100 years. But I don't think he really feels that way. As we get to know him more, I think he respects Jaime more than he respects Tyrion, but I don't think he respects Jaime.
I think you're right. I think he sees Jaime as a chess piece he can play with. It's a much easier piece to work with than Tyrion, but it's still a piece to work with and not his child.
And he doesn't respect Joffrey. I don't think
Yeah.
he respects Cersei.
No.
So if we zoom ahead a couple books, even before he dies, I don't think he ever sees this thing outlasting him.
I mean, it's a very Logan Roy situation.
Exactly.
Where he
Yes.
says, it's not a spoiler, but line from season 4 is, I love you, but you're not serious people. And I think that's how he sees all of his children.
Right.
And I don't think he expects any of them to do anything that will outlast his own lifetime.
But his children are all fully grown now. Like, he knows who they all are. They've all settled into their positions. So at that point, why not just make yourself king?
Yeah.
Because he's not making these like passion, like in Succession. That's a great comparison, because Logan would be horrible to his children behind the scenes. But Tywin's pretty awful to Tyrion in public.
Yeah. But because Tyrion is so shameful to him. He doesn't want to be seen as being good or kind to Tyrion because Tyrion is so like visibly shameful. He doesn't treat, I mean, he's awful to Jaime and Cersei too, but not in the same way. He's not publicly a total shithead to Cersei.
But he's
like,
not
he can't do that in council meetings, you know?
He's not investing in their futures and their images, their public images, as much as even Logan Roy does.
That's true,
by
yeah.
giving them obligatory board seats.
Yeah, and because in that show, in our modern day, image, like public image and optics are much more important than they are in this world. I mean, the public image is important here too, but in a really different way. It's more about what stories get told through singers and less about like what, you know, is going to be in the New York Times or the Washington Post.
But look at what Catelyn said last chapter or 2 chapters ago, where she told Robb, if you look indecisive or if you lose, some of your men are going to go fight for the other side. Because they want clear direction.
Yeah, that's true.
Tywin undermines his kids, which undermines their future, which undermines the future of his house and name and fame. Like, the more I know about this guy, the more short-sighted he feels, which makes a bid for personal power seem like it makes more sense for him. Because he's not making a dynastic play.
Yeah, but at the same time, he gives this whole thing about how he had to go to battle when Tyrion was captured, not because he loves his son, but because it made his house look weak.
But you can't pick and choose.
Yeah.
You have to be consistent about that point.
And I think that's like his biggest flaw maybe, is that he is a little too focused on himself and less... I mean, he's a big picture thinker, but only so much, it seems like. I mean, it's hard because we don't ever get his POV. We don't ever know what he's thinking. We can guess based on the other characters who interact with him, but we never know what his ultimate plans are or his goals are.
Most of the other, like we've talked about this ad nauseum for Ned Stark, of who's the enemy he underestimates, who's the one person who brings him down, what's the linchpin, what is his fatal flaw. With Tywin, it's not that, he's kind of racist and prejudiced and he doesn't take Dany serious. Like, it's not that simple.
No. The
one enemy he underestimates or misjudges is Tyrion.
You was gonna say it's his own kid. Yeah, I think you're right.
Like, is that the one answer to this question of why aren't the Lannisters unstoppable? Because it is
because they self-implode.
But specifically Tyrion.
Yeah.
Like Cersei and Jaime, they do their own thing and disappoint him in their own ways. But Tyrion's resentment and treasons and ultimately crossbow, that's what takes him down. And I think that kind of takes the whole family down.
Yeah.
That sets them on this path where Cersei is briefly in power and she spirals out, and Jaime's in self-exile, and then he comes back to die under a roof, or however that's going to look in the books. But
yeah,
I'm struck by how much we enjoyed the companionship between Jon and Tyrion. And we've been developing this new theory of kind of baking in the sigils, almost as living metaphors into the characters of these different houses. And Tyrion feels like the lone wolf of the Lannister clan.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, he is the most like Jon. Like Tyrion is to Jon what Jon is to... Or Tyrion is to Lannisters what Jon is to the Starks, yeah.
And in a book where we have a bunch of Stark POVs and then Tyrion, and he's the most Stark-ish of the Lannisters.
Yeah, sure.
It's interesting that he's the linchpin. At least that's my argument here.
Yeah.
I think Tyrion is the sole reason that the Lannisters don't hold this puppeteering power in perpetuity. I didn't do that on purpose.
That's funny. I could see that because, you know, like we said, Tywin is terrible to Jaime and Cersei as well. He's this, you know, classic, like, domineering, super high powered father who you can never please enough, who will never be proud of you. You're always seeking his approval. You hate him, but you love him, and you can't stop trying to get him to love you back. But I think that, like I said earlier, like the Lannister house kind of self implodes. They're all so obsessed with keeping the Lannister name strong. They're obsessed with the strength of their house, but they're going about it in their own way and not working together. And I think if you don't have Tyrion, the Lannister infighting is not as intense. Like, because Jaime and Cersei, Cersei hates Tyrion also because Tyrion killed their mother in her eyes. And he's an embarrassment to her, and they don't get along. And Jaime, and also she hates Tyrion because she hates her father, because her father doesn't love her because she's not a son. And so, like, Cersei sees Tyrion, even though he is this dwarf, as getting more power and
privilege,
options compared to her, even though he's not even a full man in her eyes. So, like, that anger she experiences towards her father is exacerbated by Tyrion's existence. In the same way, Jaime and Cersei, have their own special relationship, but Tyrion gets in the way of that because Jaime loves Tyrion in a way that Cersei does not. And so it all is way more complicated because of Tyrion. So I don't think the Lannister house implodes as intensely as it does without Tyrion. I think you're so right. Also, like, literally, Jaime and Cersei don't kill Tywin, but Tyrion does. So there is also that. So I think you're right.
Yeah, I'm trying to second guess this label because I'm calling Tywin a kingmaker. He bankrolls Robert Baratheon. Ultimately, we know that the crown is very much in debt to exclusively Tywin.
Yeah.
But the fact that Joffrey becomes king, Tywin doesn't order the death of Robert Baratheon.
Right.
So Joffrey just happens to become king.
It happens to work out. Yeah.
If we're calling Tywin the kingmaker, his downfall is that he doesn't make any kings. Like, he doesn't properly mold either of his sons to eventually become king, and he doesn't take the crown for himself.
Well, and he also, I don't think he knows that Joffrey is not a Baratheon.
Sure.
So it's not like it was all Tywin's doing that resulted in this truly Lannister king of Joffrey. Like, I don't think he knows that, or like, he didn't set up his kids together, so he's not really in charge of that. He created his Lannister children to be what they are, and they do a lot of the working, and they still rely on him for, not advice, I wouldn't say any of them would admit to taking his advice, but they rely on him for help, for money, and like they want to do what daddy would approve of most. So like he's hugely influential in that way. But you're right, he's not really the one acting in this kingmaker role.
I think he could have been the kingmaker, but he just isn't.
Yeah, I think, well, you know what it is? Maybe he could have until his own son became the king slayer. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. And his wife died in childbirth. Like, all of these things just pivoted in the wrong direction. And then the second son came out a dwarf. All these things that he views as kind of fate slighting him.
Yeah, failures.
Yeah. But let's talk about Tyrion a bit more, because he's the other piece of this puzzle.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Well, and I liked what you said earlier about how, like, you were pointing out how Tyrion had bested people like Catelyn, outsmarted everybody so far, and then he gets here and Tywin just fully, like,
wipes the floor with him.
Right, or snowmobiles right over him, right? I was really struck by sort of the cyclical nature of Tyrion's story as it happens in this chapter, because Tyrion ends up back at that same inn where Catelyn captured him early on in the story.
Oh, cool.
Not the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story is at Winterfell, then he's at the Wall, but things really start, going off the rails for Tyrion when he gets to this inn. And that's where Catelyn captures him. And Tyrion recognizes that. He says, the inn at the crossroads. The gods are good. Like, he's being sarcastic. He's being funny. And I double checked. It is the same inn.
That's awesome.
Especially because Tyrion sees the innkeeper. She is hanging. Remember, she's got the red teeth, that lady with the stained red teeth who Catelyn knew as a child. That's the body that's hanging from, like, right outside the inn that the crows and the ravens are attacking.
I got distracted thinking about meat pies and bread and beer. I should have caught that and I didn't.
No, it's okay.
I'm hungry.
It was subtle, but I was thinking about that. I was like, why have this be so circular? And I was thinking about it seems like Tyrion is in the same place that he was when he was captured by Catelyn, both metaphorically and literally. Literally, he's back in the inn, but figuratively, he's he has been captured by and owned by somebody else. When it was with Catelyn had captured him and he was at the will of, Catelyn and her and the guys who were supporting her. Here, he's been bested by his father and is basically owned by these mountain clans. They're saying, like, your life is in our hands until we get the gold that you and your father have promised us. And so Tyrion is once again back to where he started, held captive by somebody else, not able to do what he wants to do, and is basically powerless. And I was trying to figure out what that means for his story, for his character, and I don't really know. Is it this idea that he's just going to constantly, because he's still just as scared of his father as he was back then. He hasn't really gotten anywhere other than he didn't die. And so I don't know what it means for him.
Well, I think living on the end of that yo-yo string of trying to go out on your own and always ending up back here at square one, kind of forced to grovel at your father's feet. That's Kendall Roy's entire arc. That's
right.
all of the kids' arcs in succession.
Sure. And you could look at it in that really negative way, but then I thought maybe it's a little more positive, because what happened throughout, but before we got back here, like we had said, when he was with Catelyn, he won that entire exchange. He got out of his captivity. He escaped the moon door. He escaped crazy, young Robert Arryn and Lysa. He escaped all of that, got all of these clansmen this mountain clans on his side. He's gonna go do this great thing. So maybe it's telling us that he's done this before and he can do it again. He's dealt with people outsmarting him or people trying to capture him or own him in whatever way that means. But he can beat them, and he has done it, and he will do it again. So maybe it's, and we know that because if we, with our bias, zoom out and look at how this story goes, he will ultimately defeat his father, very literally and figuratively. So I wonder if it's that's the more positive spin.
I think it's that we've seen this character win. Most of his exchanges, he's funnier, he's smarter, he's quicker than most of these people.
He's always outsmarting everybody, yeah.
But the way he talks about himself in his life, he's very used to losing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we now have to see that. And I think seeing him in defeat is almost as telling about his character, because he doesn't complain or push back. It's a pick your battles kind of situation, where when Tywin rolls in and completely railroads him, Tyrion just falls back and plans and regroups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he doesn't fight back immediately in the moment.
No.
Because that's not where his strength is. He's more of a
There's no strength in that.
Yeah.
Next to Tywin.
Yeah, no, of course not. Yeah, Tywin, who's taller than him sitting down,
But there is something telling about this. And I think it's the same kind of scrappiness that we keep admiring, that adaptability that we keep admiring in Jon Snow. I was trying to figure out, because this chapter made me a little bit discouraged for Tyrion's arc, because we're seeing him react to being outfoxed and how this relationship is introduced in the flesh with Tywin. Is it just going to be a rivalry of them making power plays against each other? Is it just going to be a railroading where in every exchange Tywin forces Tyrion into submission? Or are we going to see Tyrion just roll out of town and kind of go into this self-imposed exile every time Tywin walks into a room? And I think I see some seeds of his future here, because Tyrion is the only Lannister who survives this series. The same way we talk about Jon being kind of the lone wolf, and against the axiom, the lone wolf tends to do better in this world. And I think I see the seeds of his Dany arc here, because that's him leaving what he's comfortable in and the sphere in which he has influence. He can flex his last name, he can invoke his father, and get whatever tools, money, a room at an inn, whatever he wants. He leaves that to go be on Dany's side, because he sees a better horse to back in this Game of Thrones. But I think he kind of does that here with the Moon Clans. When they're talking to Tywin, and he says, "Oh, hey, our honored guests," when they just blow into the end, he's like, "Hey, what do you want here?" Yeah. And the Moon Clan say, "Horses." That felt really pointed. And that made me think about the Dothraki.
Oh, okay.
Because Tyrion's eventually going to end up going over to the side with the Dothraki army and kind of the remnants of that initial clan. And I love seeing these Moon Clans because they are developed in sort of a silly way. Timett, son of Timett, all of that.
Yeah,
and
right.
Peter Dinklage plays it for wonderful comedy
Cut
in
off
the
his
show.
manhood, feed to the goats. Yeah,
exactly. These recurring kind of punchlines. They feel like a Funhouse Dothraki, But I think the telling thing from a character perspective is that Tyrion is one of the only characters in this book, and definitely the only Lannister, willing to deal with people like this.
That's absolutely true. Tywin would never consider using these mountain clans people for anything. He would consider, like, getting rid of them and bowling through them and defeating them and like just trying to, like an annoying bug that's flying in your face. But he would never think to ally with them or work with them or use them in the way that Tyrion has planned to do.
He has less of that entrenched wisdom and prejudice like his father would.
And of course his father does in this moment, now that they're in front of him, choose to use them, but only after Tyrion's done all the dirty work for him.
Yeah, found them, brought them, demonstrated their usefulness.
Right.
And if you look at, like, if we had a map and you could chart where all the characters that we follow in the POVs have gone, Tyrion's our most worldly.
Definitely. He's gone all over.
He's visited almost every major location that we have so far.
Right.
So I think it is that worldliness, that scrappiness, that adaptability. I think what he does with the Moon Clans here is kind of what he's going to do later with Dany.
That's really cool. I like that as a little foreshadowing. Because I had totally forgotten about these mountain clans being like part of Tyrion's story. I just I remember the feed it to the goats thing, but like not really. So that's cool to see like what larger part this part of the story has to play. I really like it. My last thing I noticed in this chapter was like the presence of ravens and crows and birds. I mean, birds are constantly throughout all these fantasy stories. If y'all remember our Witcher coverage, we had Maggie's bird corner about once a month, and it was pretty fun. And I'm not doing that here, but I was just struck by how present they are, because as Tyrion's like approaching this Lannister camp, walking through it, seeing the dead bodies, he's noticing ravens and crows and other birds quite a lot, but mostly ravens. And I was like, why? Because we know from the very beginning of this story that ravens carry messages, and often the messages are not good. They're ominous, the dark wings, dark words. We learned that in like chapter 2 with Catelyn. And so that's like the primary function of ravens, is to carry messages and be this like method of communication and to help keep the world moving. But here, the presence of ravens is like an indicator of death. Tyrion can recognize, fighting happened here recently. A battle took place here. There are birds everywhere. There are ravens everywhere. We learned that the corpse of the innkeeper, the lady with the red teeth, her whole face and body have been pecked at by crows, by ravens. And so it's not only that ravens are carriers of news and messages and communication, they also accompany death, or they come right after death. And I didn't really know what to make of that, like, because that's like the message that I'm getting from this chapter. You don't have to think about it too hard to know that ravens equal death. Like, that's pretty clear. And so I was trying to figure out what that means. Like, why do that in this chapter with Tyrion? Why have that happen at all? Is the idea that there's something ominous in Tyrion's future that we need to look out for? Is it more that he feels trapped? Do we connect it with the cycles thing, with the circles I was talking about, that Tyrion's often trapped in this cycle of being bested by others, or that he's always near death, is going to have to fight it? Like, is it bigger picture? Is it about the just tragic nature of this world? I don't know. But I was just trying to figure out why do that with the ravens and why have them here.
I think we talked about a lot of different kinds of birds in previous installments of Maggie's Bird Corner. And I think there's almost an amalgamation of all of the birds that we're going to talk about in this world into crows and ravens. Because all the features you just described, I would traditionally ascribe to vultures.
Right.
But you're right that so far, for the last year we've talked about this, all of those features and qualities and omens and almost the metaphorical value of that imagery has been concentrated in crows. So I think it's a condensing of imagery and metaphor, but I also think it's some quiet connective tissue for Bran.
Okay.
Three-eyed raven.
About Bran. Yeah,
that's what I think of.
Okay.
And every time I see a bird, I check its forehead to see if it's Bran watching someone else.
Of course it's Bran. I feel so silly for not even making that connection.
But I don't even think there's a Tyrion and Bran the Broken. I know there's a Tyrion-Bran relationship eventually
I guess.
Season 8, but I think it's more that we need Bran to eventually feel ever-present.
Yeah.
So we need to dust in.
Plant those seeds.
Anytime we've got a landscape shot, throw some crows in there, it'll pay dividends later with Bran.
I see. That makes a lot more sense. I like that more. And maybe it's not so much about Tyrion. I think it is more of a big picture thing.
I think it's that too. Because I was talking about this chapter feeling like a long red carpet and this really dreary kind of, you hear the Jaws theme, this long road to Tywin's reveal. Along that road, we're thinking about all the people Tywin has ruined, killed, deposed, outfoxed. So some of those crows, in the same way you think of a vulture showing up after a dead body, that pulls us back to the story about Tysha and all the other victims laying at Tywin's feet.
I see. And there's even a thing about like when we meet Tywin, somebody, Tyrion says, or the narration in Tyrion's head says that somebody once joked that Tywin's shit also has gold in it. And like the rumor is that that person is still alive and is like trapped in the dungeons of Casterly Rock to be tortured for forever. So we get the sense of Tywin's like power and influence and ability to wreak havoc and enact death or, something worse than death.
And it's not about seeing him kill people on a battlefield.
Right.
It's about that eerie silence that surrounds him. It's the total lack of objection. It's that people know better than to challenge him. And I think the crows are the way that you kind of paint that picture without a bunch of clumsy exposition.
Okay, cool. I think that makes sense. Yeah, I was excited to try and understand that a little better, and I feel like I do. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Tywin kind of gate crashed our Christmas episode.
He did. Thanks, Tywin. Merry Christmas. Well, what do you think about the crows and the ravens and the birds and Tywin's introduction and Tyrion's character arc and everything else we talked about? Please let us know if you're on YouTube down below in the comments, or if you're listening on a podcast platform, you can send us an email, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. We love hearing your ideas and sharing them on the show. Or if you're on our Patreon, you can just comment straight on this post or also email us. Did you know we have a Patreon? We have a Patreon. We put out lately 2 episodes a month, 2 bonus episodes a month, but it's at least 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 4 if it's the summer and we're doing an entire Fire and Blood series. So it's a special surprise every time. But we do bonus episodes where, like I said, we had our Fire and Blood series where we read the entire source material for the House of the Dragon TV show. But also we talk about other things on this show.
We just dropped the latest installment of our Breakfast Buffet series. We talked about 4 really interesting works of drama and horror. So on the horror side, we had Werewolves, which was a really fun kind of action-y B movie. We had A Real Pain, which was the Jesse Eisenberg, Kieran Culkin. Speaking of Succession, we had some of that in there. What were the other 2?
Heretic was the other horror movie.
Grant. Thank you.
And we talked about Queer.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that was unbelievable.
That was a really fun discussion.
I loved that.
So we have, I think that's like number 16 or 17 of our
17.
Of our Breakfast Buffet series. So we have lots of those roundups and fun discussions, but also bonus episodes on all sorts of other things. Patreon's $2 a month. You can support the show and get access to all of that bonus content.
Yeah, it's years of bonus episodes
we got lots in
piled up over there.
So you'll never be bored.
As a minor scheduling update, we are just finishing as we wrap up December. We're finishing our month-long retrospective of Robert Eggers' filmography.
Yes.
We started with a roundup of his 3 short films over on our Patreon. We continued that with blowout episodes on The Lighthouse, The Witch, and The Northman. And obviously we do episodes every Tuesday and Friday. If you haven't been around here, that's when we upload. But we're interrupting our regularly scheduled program for our Nosferatu episode, which instead of waiting for Tuesday, we're going to be dropping this Sunday at the regular time.
So get excited for that. And that's not a Patreon episode. That's available for everybody, as is the rest of those Eggers episodes besides the short films. We're actually seeing Nosferatu tonight on the day we're recording this, so we're very excited. Can't wait to talk about one of the most anticipated movies of the year.
On Tuesday, we'll be doing our final episode of the year, the 2024 installment of The Breckies.
That's right.
Our very weird and incredibly subjective awards show.
Yeah, it's where we sort of like go back through the year and pick out our favorites, both new to us this year and also new that came out in this year. We've done it in different ways over the past few years. This will be a little bit shorter, but it'll be exciting, and we're excited to share it with you. So lots more exciting things to come. Thank you so much for listening. Lemon Tarts in Space is available on Cam's website in the link down below. And we'll see you next.
Nope.
Oh, what?
We'll see you on Sunday.
Oh, on Sunday. Oh, yeah.
For a very special brand new episode on Nosferatu.